Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm your host, Dori Pham. Join me and my fellow public policy classmates as we explore potential policy solutions for today's most pressing societal challenges. Welcome back to Policy Chats. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Thomas Countryman, a distinguished career diplomat who served as Assistant Secretary for the State of International Security and Nonproliferation from 2011 to 2015. In that role, he was at the forefront of U.S. efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and to negotiate complex arms control agreement during a critical period in global security. He now serves as the chair of the board of the Arms Control Association, where he continues to shape public debate and policy on nuclear nonproliferation and international security. In today's episode, we'll explore the realities of arms control policymaking, the challenges of diplomacy, both inside and outside the government, and take a closer look of one of the most pressing issues today, Iran's nuclear program and the future of diplomatic engagement. So, moving to our first question, let's move back a bit. During your years as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, you were working at the intersection of diplomacy, deterrence, and treaty enforcement. For listeners who may not be familiar with that office, how would you describe its real influence inside the State Department, and what did that role teach you about the gap between how arms control is discussed publicly and how it is actually negotiated inside the government?
Thank you very much, Dori, for the kind introduction and for having me with you here today. I've had the honor to speak to UC Riverside students in Washington a couple of times, and I've always found that they have fantastic questions and deep interests. So my respect to the School of Public Policy. You gave a very short summary of my 36 years as a Foreign Service officer with the Department of State. And so the first point no apologies. The first point I would make about the position I held for the last 5.5 years of my tenure at the State Department is that it built upon all the other things I had done as a diplomat. That's what made the Foreign Service career ideal for me, that I changed topics and assignments many times during my career, but always building upon previous experience, being given ever greater responsibility. So when I was nominated by President Obama to be the Assistant Secretary for International Security and Nonproliferation in 2011, it was not because I was the best expert in the U.S. Department of State for non-proliferation issues. It was because I had built a good reputation as someone who knew how to get things done in the bureaucracy and someone who provided effective leadership and supervision for the people working under me. So I brought those skills with me to an area that I knew something about. But of course, I relied upon the expertise of 200 people working for me in the Bureau of Nonproliferation. And that's one of the things that made it such a fascinating job, was that I had both public policy specialists who were not afraid of the science, and we had some amazing scientists who were not reluctant to get into the intricacies of public policy formulation. So to lead that group and to rely on their knowledge and expertise in advancing U.S. interests was an extraordinary experience. But really, to come to the heart of your question, the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, ISN at that time, was just one of more than 20 bureaus in the Department of State. And we needed to interact with almost all of those other bureaus to accomplish our mission, which was preventing any further spread of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons around the world. Perhaps the hardest part of it, and it's not unique to the nonproliferation job, is the fact that within the Department of State, we have both geographic bureaus and functional bureaus. So the geographic bureaus are those you've probably heard of: the Bureau for European Affairs, the Bureau of East Asian Affairs, Bureau of African Affairs, etc. The functional bureaus are probably less well known outside of the State Department, and those include nonproliferation, arms control, human rights, international communication matters, political, military, a wide range of bureaus whose job was to try to bring some consistent policy in each of those areas across the entire world, that the U.S. would have a similar approach to human rights, whether it was in Africa or the Middle East or East Asia, that we would have a consistent policy as much as we could on nonproliferation across a range of countries. That's the purpose of the functional or the global bureaus. The regional bureaus, on the other hand, have a slightly different orientation. They appreciate the consistency of the U.S. approach across multiple regions, but they also have a need to balance conflicting interests with the need to maintain good relations with our best allies and to build better relations with those who are not such good allies or even adversaries. And so this created always a little bit of tension between those bureaus and the goals of the functional bureaus. So in my particular case, in the Bureau of Nonproliferation, ISN, we would have to deal, for example, with the conflicting interest of the East Asian Bureau when the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was looking for exceptions to our general non-proliferation policy. To some extent, it was the Bureau of East Asian Affairs advocating the South Korean position, whereas my job and that of my bureau was to seek to maintain a consistent global position. This showed up on issues such as, would the U.S. approve of the Republic of Korea developing longer range missiles? Or would the U.S. approve of South Korea developing the technology, uranium enrichment or reprocessing of spent fuel, that might give South Korea access to fissile material for a nuclear weapon? Some of those issues I won, some of them I lost. More frustrating, perhaps, was the kind of conflict that comes about, and conflict is not the right word, but tension, when you have a very sensitive negotiation. So, for example, there were very tightly controlled discussions at a senior level within the U.S. government about the approach to the DPRK, North Korea. And since that issue was primarily about North Korea's nuclear capability, I always felt that I and my team needed to be part of those high-level discussions. But the discussion was held so very tightly that we were effectively locked out of those discussions. Similarly, with the negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, it was my view that I should be part of the senior negotiating team. That was not the view of the Undersecretary of State who led that negotiating team. She did. This is Wendy Sherman, a very accomplished diplomat. She did include a couple of people from my team as technical advisors on nuclear issues. So I was somewhat aware of what was happening in the negotiation. But the concern about how sensitive those negotiations were, the need to prevent any premature leak to the press, these kept the core negotiating team very small. So these were the kind of issues on which we could have disagreements just based upon the structure of the State Department and kind of the realities of sensitive negotiations. But the second part of your question, is there a gap between the way that the State Department and the US government discuss arms control publicly and what we pursue in private negotiations? I think the answer is no. There's not really a gap, at least during the Obama administration when I served. There has been strong US government support for nuclear arms control from every president from John F. Kennedy forward. Mr. Trump's support has been more equivocal, but it has always been a priority of the United States to reduce nuclear risk. And to a great extent, previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, succeeded in reducing that risk. Both the United States and Russia have reduced their stockpiles of nuclear weapons by 85% since the Cold War peak. And that's a significant accomplishment. It was a frustration from 2014 forward that we have not had substantive negotiations with Russia about additional arms control agreements. But the public rhetoric, again, of the Obama and the Biden administrations, I think was positive in those regards and fairly clear about the end goals of reduced nuclear arsenals and reduced nuclear risk that we wanted to reach.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer and your insight, kind of like behind the scenes on how the US and its government, especially in the Biden and Obama administration, view on nuclear weapons. And I completely think it's great that we are trying to reduce the best way possible, reduce nuclear weapons since there's such a huge destruction power. And it's really important that we have control over them and manage expectations clearly. Looking back on your time in government, what do you think policymakers and the public still misunderstands the most about non-proliferation work? In particular, when the US is dealing with adversaries or strategic competitors, how do officials balance ideal goals such as preventing proliferation entirely with a more realistic goal of reducing the risk of through like imperfect but enforceable agreements?
Okay, another excellent question. So let me talk about two different dimensions here. One, I think the point that is difficult for sometimes the public and sometimes the policymakers to understand is that non-proliferation is an absolute priority of the United States, not a relative priority. So in other words, everybody will say, yes, of course, we don't want proliferation of nuclear weapons, but we have so many other interests with countries, some of whom are our friends. And so can't we compromise our goal of non-proliferation in order to provide better security and better relations with some of our partners overseas? So this has shown up in a number of ways over the years. If you go all the way back to the presidency of Richard Nixon, when he came to office, he seemed to favor allowing U.S. allies to acquire their own nuclear weapons. Him down and explained why that was a bad idea. And so the President Nixon, to his credit, went in the opposite direction and supported the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty that came into effect in 1970. A second example of compromising your non-proliferation principles for geopolitical, geostrategic considerations came in the administration of President Bush, the younger President Bush, when India, which had never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Pakistan conducted nuclear weapons tests in 1998. It led to some automatic sanctions that the U.S. imposed on both India and Pakistan. And just a few years later, that limited the scope of cooperation we could have with each country. But just a few years later, in the Bush administration, it was considered that India was such an important geostrategic partner, in some ways a counterweight to China, that we had to make a compromise and soften our opposition to India's nuclear weapons program. That became one of the hardest burdens I had to carry during my time as Assistant Secretary. President Obama did not reverse this decision, and it won't be reversed in the future. But the fact that the U.S. had been the strongest advocate of strict non-proliferation controls, but then made an exception for China, was something that made all of the work that I did as Assistant Secretary a little bit more difficult. And as I've already mentioned, with South Korea, the Republic of Korea, there are again people in government under the Trump administration who have said publicly, maybe it's not a bad idea if we allow South Korea to obtain its own nuclear weapons. After all, they're a good friend. And what I think they fail to recognize is you cannot make one exception. Once you have opened the door to saying, we are okay with this country having nuclear weapons, there will be no end to the cascade. It will be a slow-moving cascade for sure. Nobody can create a nuclear weapons program overnight. But making exceptions for friends or being too much tougher on adversaries is the way that you lose your consistency and your leadership of the global non-proliferation regime. So that's one dimension of your question, that if you've got a principle that serves American national security interests, such as preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, you have to be consistent with both friends and opponents. The second dimension of this is touched on in your question, which is what is a realistic goal? And I think we'll talk about this some more when we talk about Iran. But it's now a long time ago, and you were very young then. But in 2015, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that Obama's administration concluded with Iran, was criticized by Trump and Republicans because it didn't solve all the problems we had with Iran at once. It didn't address Iran's support for terrorist groups. It didn't address Iran's development of ballistic missiles. It didn't address human rights. I usually add it also did not cure cancer or reduce the price of gasoline. It dealt with one issue, the nuclear file for Iran, and effectively solved that issue. But the criticism from the right that it didn't solve all of our issues with Iran was, I think, not well founded. I don't know of any diplomatic agreement, except perhaps the founding of the United Nations, that solved all problems at once. It was intended to solve the most important problem so that every other problem we had with Iran could be dealt with one at a time. That's the way we do diplomacy. All the arms control agreements that were concluded between Washington and Moscow addressed only nuclear issues, not any of the other issues that divided Russia or the Soviet Union from the United States. And we kept talking about nuclear arms control constantly with the Russians, Soviets and then Russians, for 50 years, regardless of what else was happening. When Soviet weapons were killing American servicemen in Vietnam, we were still talking about nuclear arms control. When American weapons were killing Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan, we were still talking about arms control. So the thing that I think that the critics fail to grasp is that you are not going to solve every single issue at once. You have to have a realistic goal of having a verifiable, practicable arms control arrangement. That's what we accomplished in 2015. And I don't believe, we'll talk about this in a minute, that President Trump is going to accomplish a better deal than we had.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I, again, completely agree with you that, diplomacy takes time. It doesn't happen uh, in a night, And so it's really important that, diplomats like you are taking these steps to reduce our nuclear, population in the world. So let's move to like the current situation now. So you currently serve as the chair of the board of Arms Control Association, um, and this association is outside of formal government, but still deeply engaged in policy debates, policy advising. So, how has the shift changed the way that you think about influence? Do you believe that experts and civil society organizations can sometimes be more candid and more strategically useful than officials inside government, especially when nuclear policy becomes politically charged?
Okay. Well, let me say a few words first about the Arms Control Association, because I hope your students would be very interested in our work. When I was assistant secretary, I would see the analysis and the proposals that came from the Arms Control Association, ACA, and I was very impressed with the thought process, the quality of the recommendations that they made. When I retired after President Trump replaced me during his first term, I was very happy to join the board and become chairman of the board of ACA, because I discovered that these very high quality proposals and analysis had been produced by a very small team, a dozen people, who that was the entire NGO that was making these excellent presentations. And so I'm happy since then to donate my time to serve as chairman. The executive director and the staff do all of the work, but I help as much as I can with my time. I hope that all your listeners would go to our website, simply armscontrol.org, and see the work that we do, and then sign up to be members. I can guarantee you, you cannot join a more prestigious association at a lower annual price than the Arms Control Association. So I hope everyone will look into it. I try to stay engaged together with colleagues from ACA and colleagues from many other non-governmental organizations in this field in the policy debates. One way that ACA uniquely tries to do this is we remain small because we don't take money from the defense industry or from the civilian nuclear energy industry. We think that that would compromise our objectivity on all of these issues. But we try to work closely with the other NGOs in the field, all of whom include former officials who really know these issues well. And yes, there's a great advantage to being outside of government. What I've tried to do now that I'm outside of government is to use the same skills that I learned as a US diplomat to analyze the policy, the reasons behind the policy of other governments, and apply those same analytical skills to what the United States says and does. And as a consequence, I'm able to make statements that I could not have made while serving the US government. For example, when I was an active US diplomat, I could never say out loud that Israel possesses nuclear weapons. I knew it was true, but it was not something that we were allowed to say as an official government spokesman. Now I can tell you frankly, yes, Israel does possess nuclear weapons. A second one that is very relevant right now relates to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And the NPT is the very cornerstone of the global non-proliferation regime. We have a review conference every 5 years for the NPT, and twice before I have served as the deputy chairman of the U.S. delegation to those conferences. The next review conference is starting at the end of April, just 2 weeks away. Less than that, 10 days away. And it will be chaired by an excellent diplomat, the permanent representative of Vietnam to the United Nations, Ambassador Viet of the conference. Now, it's not necessarily the most difficult topic at the conference, but it is the one that, in a sense, overrides everything else, which is since the Non-Proliferation Treaty came into effect in 1970, the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states, America, Russia, Britain, France, China, have had the legal obligation to pursue good faith negotiations to reduce and eliminate their arsenals. Now, one thing that I would say when I was in the government was the U.S. is doing this. We are pursuing good faith negotiations right now, but we don't have a partner. Russia and China should be our partners, but they're not. What I would say differently as an independent analyst with a non-governmental organization right now is that none of the 5 are meeting their legal obligation to pursue arms reduction negotiations. Each of the 5 has a different reason for saying, for a different excuse for why there are no negotiations at the moment. But none of the 5 at this time are making a serious effort that is their legal obligation under the treaty. So that's just another example of how much more freedom I have today. There's one other point. We try to, of course, give our opinions as ACA, and our opinions include recognizing that there are real national security concerns that the United States and other countries have, but that these concerns can be addressed in a way that does not increase the risk of use of nuclear or chemical or biological weapons. And we try to get that point across to the public, to members of Congress, and to the administration. But there are great differences in receptivity. The first Trump administration was not interested in hearing the views of outside parties. And the second Trump administration is even more resistant to listening to views of NGOs like mine. So, it easier to talk to the government of China, and they are willing to engage in serious discussion. That's easier than having the same conversation with the United States government today. So we will keep trying to get important policy analysis and recommendations across to the administration, to the public, and to the Congress as well.
But as a follow-up, you mentioned that there is a upcoming nuclear proliferation agreement this coming end of April, starting in May. And that includes countries like Vietnam, Finland, Ghana, and Kazakhstan. So out of curiosity, why were those countries selected to be in the talks, in the agreements? Just because like those countries, they don't possess nuclear weapons. So I was just wondering why would those countries be selected for the treaty?
Social injustice, health disparities, and climate change. Are you interested in pressing challenges like these facing our region and world? Make your impact by joining the next cohort of the UCR Master of Public Policy program. Learn more at mpp.ucr.edu.
Well, actually, there are, I think, 180 countries that have signed and ratified the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. The only countries on Earth that are not in the treaty are North Korea, Israel, India, Pakistan. So theoretically, there could be 180 delegations meeting in New York. Some of the smaller countries will not send a delegation. The countries you mentioned, Vietnam, Finland, Ghana, and Kazakhstan, these are the president and the vice presidents of the conference. And they were chosen to serve in that role according to a geographic rotation among the different regions of the world. All four of them happen to be exceptionally strong defenders of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. But it is a very large event where there are thousands of speeches and unfortunately not enough dialogue.
And can you tell us more? What do you mean by 1,000 speeches and not enough dialogue? And when you mention dialogue, what dialogue do you want to happen more?
So I've been now to several review conferences of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. As I said, they occur only every 5 years. The purpose is to look at the treaty again, for each country to report to the conference with a written report. Here is what we have done to meet our obligations under the treaty. There should be an evaluation of how the treaty in general is operating. What are the threats to the treaty? What are the inconsistencies that have prevented its full implementation? And that means, unfortunately, being critical of other countries. And all too often, the criticism is between China and the United States, or between Russia and Ukraine. And that's inevitable. There's also criticism of the non-nuclear weapon states directed towards the nuclear weapon states for the reason that I mentioned, that they haven't made more progress in disarmament. And every country wants to make a statement at this review conference of how good their record is and identifying what countries have not done in support of the treaty. But there's two problems with that. One is people stick to generalities. They don't get very specific. And two, once 100, not 180, but 100 plus countries have made a speech, there's only so much time left for actually engaging with each other and actually having a dialogue. And the format of the conference is such that you can't really have an exchange between representatives of the non-nuclear weapon states and the 5 recognized nuclear powers. We try to do some of that. So, for example, within the Arms Control Association, I am organizing what they call a side event. That is a seminar outside of the formal meeting structure at which we can sit and do a critique of the 5 nuclear weapons states' actual record of performance. Now, of course, the final thing the conference should do, besides reviewing what has happened, is to write a document that says, here's what went well, here's what are still problems, and here are recommendations that all of us agree should be met by the states that are party to the treaty. This is called an outcome document, and it requires consensus. That is, every state must agree. The last 2 meetings, we have not had a consensus outcome. In 2015, it was blocked by the United States. 5 years later, it was blocked by Russia. So there is pressure to have a more successful outcome this time, and the pressure on everybody to compromise to get to consensus has to be balanced against an honest accounting of the real problems that the treaty faces, even though some states are not looking forward to having that discussion.
Yeah, sometimes it can be hard for diplomats to tell the actual truth and
yes.
to walk around the problem. So to move on, in your recent work, you have argued that for pragmatic priorities in renewed U.S. and Iran talks. When you use the word pragmatic, what does that mean in concrete policy terms? Does it mean accepting interim constraints, narrower verification goals, or a phased process rather than demanding a perfect agreement at the outset?
The first thing it means, even before negotiations begin, is deciding to act like professional diplomats. The United States has failed this test recently. The negotiators sent to talk to Iran in Geneva in February were 2 real estate agents, one of them the president's son-in-law, who also is literally on the payroll of the Saudi Arabian government at the same time. Neither of them had expertise in nuclear matters. Neither of them had experience with Iran or in the Middle East, or in fact, any diplomatic negotiation. And they did not bring with them to Geneva any nuclear experts, technical experts, or anybody who understood something about Iran. And that helped to bring us to this war today. The first thing that helped get us to this war was Trump's decision in 2018 to violate an agreement with Iran that had been functioning well. But the second thing was to send two incompetent negotiators who did not understand what Iran was offering, who simply wanted to hear, we give up, we capitulate, we accept all American demands. So when Iran made on February 26th what I consider to be a good basis for negotiating an agreement, they simply saw it as rejection, not a move that requires a counter proposal, but a rejection of U.S. demands. And 2 days later, Iran was attacked and its leadership murdered by the Trump administration. So the first thing in terms of pragmatic priorities in talking to Iran is get some damn professionals in the room instead of people who have no idea what they're doing. If you get to that spot of actual negotiations with Iran, as we seem to be right now, and I don't know on this day, April 17th, if these discussions are involving Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner, or are they involving people who actually know what they're doing. So some of the things that they should be talking about include interim measures. What are things that the two sides can do right now to reduce tension, build confidence, not just in words, but concrete steps that each side could take that gives the other side confidence that it's worth making an agreement? It would be hard to criticize the Iranian government for not believing anything that a U.S. negotiator says. After all, we have had twice in the last year the U.S. negotiating with Iran and then launching a surprise military attack just days later. So what are practical things that each side can not just talk about, but do in order to create some confidence that the ceasefire can continue and that negotiations can go somewhere? Similarly, they should be finding the language that enables both sides to say, we got what we needed. Not an absolute victory, but we got what we needed. This is more than just face saving. This is each side being able to say, at the end of this discussion, we made some compromises, but we got the thing that was most important to us. And there certainly is room in the current situation to create such an outcome where the leadership in both countries can say, we got what we needed. This would be the right approach. I don't think that anything that the U.S. can do at this point will lead to this universal deal that solves all the problems, including ballistic missiles, support for terrorist groups, etc. I don't think that Trump can get that deal. I don't think he will get a better deal than Obama got in 2015. But the good thing about Donald Trump is no matter what happens, he will always say it was the greatest triumph in U.S. history. So I'm not worried about him and his ability to say, God, I'm a genius.
Thank you so much for your answer. So let's move on to our next question. Recent reportings suggest that the central disputes still involve enrichment limits, stockpile disposition, and whether diplomacy can still produce a durable agreement. Based on your expertise and experience in the past, what are some of the most important questions that U.S. policymakers should be asking right now not just about Iran's capabilities, but about Iran's incentives, red lines, and the risk of setting negotiating demands so high that diplomacy between the two countries collapses altogether.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And maybe, as I said, we're recording this on April 17th. Maybe by the time some of your listeners watch this, we will either be back into a war or else the agreement will be done and the ceasefire will continue. So things to ask about. First, I think the important thing to know about the Iranian red line is that they will never give up their claim to have a right to enrich uranium. They have gone to war and accepted the coming of war in order not to give that point up. They have shown a willingness to compromise on that point. And to not exercise their right to enrich, but they will not accept an agreement where they renounce this as a right. And that seems to be what the Trump administration has sought. The negotiations that ended February 26th, that led to war just 2 days later, it was in fact, the American insistence that you must renounce this right forever that caused that diplomacy to collapse, although the collapse was chosen by the American side, not the Iranian side. There are ways to address that question. And some of the reporting of the last couple of days indicates that they are going in the logical direction, where the U.S. no longer insists that Iran renounce the right to enrich forever, but instead Iran promises not to do any enrichment for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. That's a compromise in which Iran preserves its principle, but the United States gets what we are most concerned about. By the way, that's the same thing that we did in 2015. The removal of the uranium enriched to 60% is an important issue. Again, keep in mind that if Trump had not violated the 2015 agreement, Iran would not have 60% enriched uranium today. But it has it, and that's a problem. So one of the questions is, who will remove it? Where will it be removed? Under the 2015 agreement, some enriched uranium was moved over to Russia, and that's still a good option. The most important thing is that this be done in under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's the only way to do it safely and to have real knowledge of what has been removed and what kind of concern it should be. So that's where we are today. If we were doing this podcast next week, the answers might be completely different.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, when you look at the broader context of Iran and the context of global arms control, what lessons does this case offer about the future of diplomacy itself at the moment when major power competition is intensifying and agreements like the New START have come under strain? Do you see the Iran issue as a regional nuclear problem or as a larger test of whether negotiated restraint is still politically possible in today's international system?
Okay. Well, let me break it down into kind of proliferation issues and arms control issues. On proliferation, it is important that the U.S. and Iran come to an agreement that gives us confidence that Iran is not progressing towards a nuclear weapon and that preserves the authority of the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's got to be done. But a lot of the damage in proliferation terms has already happened. When any state, any country around the world sees that an aggressive nuclear-armed state is capable of military attack, whether it's Russia against Ukraine or Israel against Lebanon or the US against Iran, every state that cares about its own sovereignty could logically conclude the only way we have to deter a rogue nuclear power is if we have our own nuclear weapons. That lesson has already been broadcast to the world by Putin, Netanyahu, and Trump, and that is not easily undone. In terms of arms control, if we look at that as related to but separate from non-proliferation, the New START treaty is gone. We still have some agreements between the US and Russia that reduce nuclear risk, but we no longer have any kind of cap on the arsenal of the two sides. What we need to see is not just a public demand, not just a social media post that says we need a new three-way agreement. What we need at the moment are practical steps towards beginning a discussion. And this is what I've been trying to get across to several governments. We don't need a great big meeting in Geneva with hundreds of journalists waiting outside. We need some quiet conversations between the US and China. And by having those conversations among experts, we can begin to define a process that will lead to reduce nuclear risk, reduce nuclear arsenals. That doesn't cost very much to try to have that dialogue. But what I see instead are three countries that are racing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars rather than take the small steps that might make it unnecessary to spend all that money and create all that danger. I'd like to see some practicality from the three biggest powers, China, Russia, and the United States. And right now, I'm not seeing it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your answer. And I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's podcast.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being on Policy Chats.
Thank you for listening to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UCR_SPP. To learn more about our program and upcoming episodes, visit spp.ucr.edu. For the video version of this episode, check out our YouTube channel at UCR School of Public Policy. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.